The wind came down off the ridge like something with teeth, and Caleb Whitfield had half a mind to turn his horse back toward the barn before the storm swallowed the last of the light. He'd been out since dawn mending fence along the northern pasture, and his fingers were stiff with cold inside his gloves, his shoulders aching from the work, and all he wanted in the world was a hot plate of beans and the warmth of his own hearth. But then he heard it, a sound so small and so broken that at first he thought it was the wind itself, some trick of the gusts whistling through the cottonwoods along Miller's Creek. He reined in his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson, and sat still in the saddle, listening. There it was again. A whimper, human and young and afraid. He swung down from the saddle before he'd even decided to, boots sinking into the mud churned up by the rain, and pushed through the brush along the creek bank with his heart hammering against his ribs. What he found there stopped him cold. A girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, he guessed, though it was hard to tell with her so thin and drawn, sat huddled against the roots of a fallen sycamore, her knees pulled to her chest, her thin cotton dress soaked through and clinging to her small frame, her lips gone the color of a bruise. Her hair, dark and matted with mud, hung in ropes around a face streaked with dirt and tears, and when she looked up at him her eyes were the kind of eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, wide and wary, the eyes of a creature that has learned the hard way that grown men are not always safe. Easy now, Caleb said, lowering himself to one knee a few feet from her, keeping his voice as soft as he knew how, the same voice he used to gentle a spooked colt. I ain't gonna hurt you. You hear me? I ain't gonna hurt you none. The girl said nothing, only trembled, her small arms wrapped so tight around her knees that her knuckles had gone white beneath the grime. Thunder rolled somewhere far off across the valley, and she flinched at the sound of it, pressing herself further into the roots of the tree as if she might disappear into them altogether. Caleb felt something crack open in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in the 3 years since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their unborn child in the plot behind the house, back when the fever took half the county and left him alone in a house too big and too quiet for one man. What's your name, sweetheart? He asked, and when she didn't answer, he tried again, gentler still. You got a mama somewhere? A papa. Somebody looking for you. At that the girl's face crumpled, and a fresh wave of tears cut clean tracks through the mud on her cheeks, and she shook her head so hard her wet hair whipped against her shoulders. Ain't got nobody, she finally whispered, her voice a cracked and rusty thing, as though she hadn't used it in days. Mama's gone. She got sick and she went to sleep and she didn't wake up and the man said I had to go with him, but I ran. I ran and I hid and I've been hiding for 2 days and I'm so cold, mister, I'm so cold. The words came tumbling out of her all at once, like water breaking through a dam, and by the time she finished she was sobbing in earnest, her small body shaking with something far deeper than the cold rain. Caleb didn't think. He simply acted, the way a man does when instinct outruns reason, and he shrugged out of his heavy oilcloth coat and wrapped it around her narrow shoulders, swallowing her whole in its folds. You're safe now, he said, and he meant it with everything in him, though he had no earthly idea what he was going to do with a lost, orphan child on a rain-swept evening with a storm bearing down on them both. I'm gonna take you home. Get you warm, get you fed. Nobody's gonna hurt you while you're with me. I give you my word on that. She looked up at him then, searching his weathered face for the lies she surely expected to find there, the way every grown man in her short life had likely given her reason to expect, but whatever she found in his eyes must have satisfied something in her, because she let him lift her into his arms, and she buried her cold face against his shoulder, and she did not fight him. The ride back to the homestead took the better part of an hour, the storm breaking open in earnest halfway through, rain hammering down in sheets that soaked them both to the bone, but the girl never made a sound, only clung to the front of his shirt with fists so small and so desperate that he could feel the tremble of her heartbeat through the fabric. By the time they reached the house, a modest but sturdy structure of hewn logs that Caleb had built with his own hands the year he married Sarah, with a wide porch and a stone chimney that had seen better days, she had gone quiet with exhaustion, her eyes fluttering closed against his chest. He carried her inside, got a fire roaring in the hearth, and set about the business of peeling her out of her sodden dress and wrapping her in one of Sarah's old flannel nightgowns, the fabric hanging off her tiny frame like a tent, and he tried very hard not to think about the fact that this was the first time in 3 years he'd taken anything of Sarah's down from the cedar chest where he'd stored her belongings, unable to give them away and unable to look at them. He fed the girl broth and cornbread that night, watching her eat with the ravenous, careful hunger of someone who had learned not to trust that food would come again, and he sat up long after she'd fallen asleep in the narrow bed in the spare room, staring into the fire and turning over in his mind all the questions he hadn't the heart to ask her yet. Who was her mother? Where had they come from? Who was the man she'd run from? And what in the world was he? A widowed rancher with no family of his own, supposed to do with a child who had nowhere else to go. He did not have an answer that night, and he did not force himself to find one. He only banked the fire, checked on her twice more before dawn to be sure she was breathing easy, and let the question wait. Her name, he learned over the following days, was Grace, and she was 6 years old, and her mother's name had been Ellen, and they had come west from Missouri after Ellen's husband, Grace's father, had died in a mining accident 2 winters back, chasing the promise of a better life that had instead delivered them into the hands of a man named Silas Corbin, itinerant trader who had taken Ellen on as what he called a housekeeper, but treated more like property, and who had made clear to Grace, once her mother's fever took her in the night on the road outside of Willow Bend, that the girl now belonged to him too, to be sold or traded or put to work as he saw fit. Grace had waited until he slept off a bottle of whiskey outside their camp and had run into the dark with nothing but the dress on her back, and she had been running and hiding ever since, surviving on creek water and whatever she could scavenge, until Caleb found her. The story settled into Caleb's chest like a stone, and in the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened and the leaves turned gold and then brown across the valley, he found himself remaking his entire life around the shape of this small, watchful girl who had wandered into it. He built her a proper bed. He rode into town and bought her shoes and a coat that fit and 3 dresses in soft, sensible colors, ignoring the raised eyebrows of the shopkeeper's wife, who clearly wondered what a bachelor rancher was doing outfitting a child. He taught her to gather eggs from the henhouse and to whistle for the dogs and, slowly, painstakingly, to laugh again, a sound that startled them both the first time it escaped her, as though she'd forgotten she was capable of it. And in turn, Grace filled the silence of his house with something he hadn't realized he'd been starving for since Sarah died. The small chaos of a child's presence, her questions about everything under the sun, her fierce and sudden affection, the way she had taken to sleeping with one small hand fisted in the sleeve of his shirt if he sat with her too long in the evenings, as if she needed to be sure he was still there. But peace, in that country and in that time, rarely lasted uninterrupted, and it was on a cold morning in late November that trouble rode back into their lives in the shape of Silas Corbin himself, who had spent the better part of 2 months asking after a runaway girl in every town and trading post between the Missouri line and the territory, and who had finally traced her to Caleb Whitfield's homestead on the strength of a description given by a shopkeeper's wife who thought nothing of mentioning the bachelor rancher who'd suddenly taken to buying children's dresses. Corbin arrived at the gate on a rangy black horse, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no warmth at all, flanked by 2 rough-looking hired men, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "I've come for what's mine," he said, sitting his horse just outside the fence line, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous calm of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "The girl. Ellenes brott. She's indentured to me, fair and legal, and I mean to collect her." Caleb had been splitting wood in the yard when the riders appeared, and he set down his axe slow and deliberate, positioning himself between the house and the men at the gate, every instinct in him rising up like a wall. "There ain't no child here belongs to you," he said, matching Corbin's flat calm with a steadiness of his own, though his heart was pounding a hard rhythm against his ribs. "And there ain't no such thing, in this territory or any other, as a child indentured to a man who bought her mother like livestock. You'd best turn that horse around." Corbin's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Careful, rancher. I've got paper on that girl signed by her mother before she died. Desperate woman with no other way to feed her child. Paper's paper, and the law tends to side with paper, even out here. You want to make this difficult, we can make it difficult." Behind him, one of the hired men shifted his hand toward the rifle slung across his saddle, and Caleb felt the moment tip toward something irreversible, felt the old cold clarity that came over him in dangerous moments, a clarity he hadn't needed since the war, since the years before Sarah, when he'd learned exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what mattered to him. "That girl," Caleb said, low and even, "has spent 2 months learning what it feels like to be safe. I buried a wife and a child of my own in the ground behind that house, and I will be damned 6 ways from Sunday before I let you put fear back into her eyes. You want her, you'll have to go through me, And I promise you, mister, that will not go the way you think it will. It was Grace, in the end, who broke the standoff. Grace, who had crept to the window at the sound of raised voices and recognized, even from that distance, the shape of the man who had haunted her nightmares for 2 months, and who came flying out of the house not in terror this time but in a fury that startled every grown man present, planting herself at Caleb's side with her small chin thrust out and her fists clenched. "I ain't going with you," she said, her voice shaking but clear, carrying across the yard with a strength that seemed impossible from someone so small. "You ain't my papa and you ain't nothing to me. This is my home now. He's my home now." And something in the raw, unflinching truth of it, a child choosing, in front of armed men, the safety she had found over the fear she had fled, seemed to shift the ground beneath even Corbin's calculated cruelty. He looked at the girl a long moment, and then at Caleb standing solid and immovable at her back, and perhaps he did the arithmetic of a fight. He was unlikely to win against a man with nothing left to lose, or perhaps some buried scrap of conscience finally stirred in him. But he spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse, and rode off without another word, his hired men falling in behind him, and he did not come back. The town, when word got around, did what small frontier towns always did. It talked, endlessly and thoroughly, about the widower rancher and the orphan girl and the trader who'd ridden off defeated, and in the midst of all that talk, a young schoolteacher named Margaret Ashford, newly arrived from the east to run the one-room schoolhouse, found herself drawn into the orbit of the Whitfield homestead when Grace was enrolled as her newest pupil. Margaret was gentle and clever and carried her own quiet griefs. A fiancé lost to the war, a family that had scattered to the winds, and she took a particular tenderness to Grace, staying late some afternoons to help the girl catch up on her letters, since nobody had thought to teach her much of anything in the hard years before Caleb found her. It was Grace, with the uncomplicated logic of a child who had already learned that love was the only thing worth building a life around, who first noticed the way her guardian's eyes softened whenever Miss Ashford's name came up at supper, and the way Miss Ashford's cheeks colored whenever Caleb came to collect his ward from the schoolhouse. It took the better part of a year of shared suppers and Sunday walks and long evenings on the porch after Grace had gone to bed, a year of two wounded, careful people learning to trust the possibility of happiness again after loss had taught them both to expect its opposite. Before Caleb worked up the courage to say aloud what had been growing quietly in his chest since the first afternoon Margaret Ashford knelt down in the schoolyard to tie Grace's bootlace and looked up at him with a smile that undid something in him he'd thought long since closed for good. He asked her to marry him on a clear October evening, the same season he'd found Grace shivering by the creek a year before, down on one knee in the very yard where he'd once stood between his daughter and the man who would have taken her, and Margaret said yes before he'd even finished the question, laughing through tears, and Grace, who had been watching from the porch steps with her hands pressed over her mouth, came running down into both their arms with a joy so complete it seemed to fill the whole valley. They were married before the first snow, a small ceremony in the yard with the whole of the town in attendance, curious and warm-hearted, and that winter the house that had stood too quiet and too empty for 3 long years was filled at last with laughter and lamplight and the smell of Margaret's bread baking in the mornings, and Grace, who had once flinched at the sound of thunder and slept with a fist curled in Caleb's sleeve for fear he'd vanish in the night, grew instead into a girl who ran barefoot through the summer grass without a shadow of fear behind her eyes. On the anniversary of the night he'd found her, Caleb took her back down to Miller's Creek, to the fallen sycamore where it had all begun, and he knelt in the same spot he'd knelt a year before, and he took her small hands in his and told her the promise he'd made her that first night, silently, before he'd had the words for it. "You'll never be alone again," he said. "Not so long as I'm breathing. You're mine now, and I'm yours, and that's a thing that don't ever change." And Grace, who had learned in the hardest way a child can learn it that the world was not always safe and love was not always given freely, wrapped her arms around the only father she had ever truly known and held on, unafraid, beneath a sky gone gold with the last light of an autumn evening, home at last, and safe and loved, for every day that was still to come.